There is a specific chapter in the first book of the Bible that most people skim over. It is often called the chapter of the begats, Genesis chapter 5. On the surface, it looks like a dry historical registry, a genealogy connecting the first human, Adam, to the survivor of the global flood, Noah. It lists names, ages of fatherhood, and total lifespans. To the casual reader, it is just a bridge between two major stories. But when you stop reading and start calculating, this list becomes one of the most problematic documents in the entire library of antiquity. It represents a collision between mythology and reality that no amount of apologetics can truly reconcile. We need to look at the numbers. Really look at them. The text claims that Adam lived for 930 years. Seth, 912. Methuselah, the record holder, 969. These aren't just outliers. They are the standard for this specific narrative era. In this textual tradition, death is a rarity that only arrives after nearly a millennium of life. When we step back and analyze this from a biological perspective, the problems begin immediately. Not just because we don't see humans living this long today, but because we understand the mechanism of aging. We know about telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of our chromosomes. Every time a cell divides, these caps get shorter. Eventually, they become too short to protect the DNA, and the cell stops dividing or dies. This is a hard limit built into the physics of biology. It is the Hayflick limit. For a human body to sustain itself for 9 centuries, the fundamental architecture of cellular reproduction would have to be entirely different from what we observe in the human species. It wouldn't just require good genes or a pristine environment, it would require a different organism entirely. Some have tried to rationalize this. You will hear arguments that the ancient atmosphere was different, a vapor canopy that shielded early humans from radiation. This is a popular idea in certain circles, but it fails under basic scrutiny. If you block enough radiation to stop aging, which isn't primarily caused by background radiation anyway, you also block the light required for photosynthesis. A canopy thick enough to alter human biology to that degree would turn the Earth into a pressure cooker. The atmospheric pressure would crush the very lungs trying to breathe it. There is also the argument of genetic purity. The idea is that the first humans had perfect DNA, and that over time, genetic entropy mutations shortened our lifespans. This sounds intuitive if you don't know genetics, but it collapses when you look at the data. Genetic diversity is what keeps populations healthy. Bottlenecks, where you have a very small breeding pool like Adam and Eve, do not create super beings. They create immediate, catastrophic inbreeding depression. The problems we see in royal families or endangered species would have been present from generation 2. We wouldn't see 900-year lifespans. We would see distinct congenital defects and likely extinction. But biology is actually the least interesting way to debunk Genesis 5. The biology is just the symptom. The real diagnosis comes when we look at history and mathematics. The smoking gun isn't in the DNA. It is in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia. When we look at the cultures surrounding ancient Israel, specifically the Sumerians, we find something remarkable. They also had a list of kings who lived before a great flood. It is called the Sumerian king list. And if you think 900 years is a long time, the Sumerians would call that a brief nap. Their kings are listed as reigning for 28,000 years, 36,000 years. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, supposedly ruled for 28,800 years. This context changes everything. It tells us that listing impossible lifespans for ancient ancestors wasn't a record of fact, it was a literary genre. In the ancient Near East, age equaled prestige. The longer a king reigned, the more legitimacy he had. It was a way of saying, our culture is ancient, our roots go back to the gods. When the authors of Genesis wrote their list, they were likely living in the shadow of these Babylonian empires. They couldn't claim 30,000-year reigns because their theology was different. They didn't view their ancestors as demigods, but as men. So, they seemingly dialed the numbers down. They kept the tradition of long-lived ancestors before the flood, but they reduced the scale. Instead of tens of thousands of years, they went with hundreds. It makes the text feel more grounded than the Sumerian myths, but it serves the exact same mythological function. It is a cultural retort, a way of saying, we also have a deep history, while separating themselves from the polytheistic excess of their neighbours. Then there is the math. And this is where it gets truly fascinating for anyone who likes patterns. If these were real ages of real people, the numbers should be random. You would expect to see people dying at 712 or 803 or 941, purely organic distribution. But that is not what we see in the Hebrew text. If you analyze the ages in Genesis 5, a suspicious pattern emerges. The numbers almost exclusively end in 0, 5, 7, or 2. This is statistically impossible for a natural data set. It suggests that these numbers are artificial, constructs based on a sexagesimal system base 60, which was the mathematical language of, you guessed it, ancient Mesopotamia. Let's look closer at the math, specifically the generation gaps. We are told how old the father was when the son was born. When you plot these numbers out, the timeline serves a very specific narrative purpose. The numbers in the Masoretic text, the Standard Hebrew Bible, are calculated so that Methuselah dies in the exact year of the flood. It's a clean, dramatic exit. The oldest man dies just as the waters rise. But here is the catch. We have other ancient versions of the Old Testament, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Greek Septuagint. These are ancient manuscripts, some older than the Masoretic texts we use today. And their numbers for Genesis 5 are different. In the Samaritan version, the ages are adjusted so that 3 different patriarchs die in the year of the flood. In the Septuagint, the numbers are inflated further to push the timeline back. This is crucial evidence. If these were recorded facts, preserved by divine inspiration, they would not fluctuate by hundreds of years depending on which manuscript tradition you read. The fact that scribes felt comfortable altering the math proves that the numbers were never seen as data in the modern sense. They were variables in a theological equation. The goal was to create a timeline that fit the theology, not to record a timeline that fit history. We also have to talk about the etymology, the names themselves. There is a popular theory often circulated in religious emails that if you translate the Hebrew names of Genesis 5 into English, they form a hidden sentence prophesying a saviour. Man appointed mortal sorrow, and so on. It's a poetic idea, extremely attractive to those looking for hidden codes, but linguistically it is a stretch. For example, the name Methuselah is often translated in these codes as his death shall bring, referring to the flood. But a more accurate etymological breakdown connects his name to the weapon he carried, like man of the dart or man of the javelin. When you force the names to form a sentence, you have to cherry-pick the most obscure definitions and ignore the standard grammatical rules of Hebrew. It is a classic case of backward engineering, finding a pattern because you desperately want one to be there. However, the names are symbolic, just not in a secret code. Canaan implies a smith or craftsman. Mahalalel implies praise of God. These are archetypes. They represent the development of civilization. The list is effectively a compressed history of humanity's skills and relationship with the divine, anthropomorphized into single individuals. We see this compression happening in the text itself. When we look at the genealogies, we see a pattern of 10 generations from Adam to Noah. Later, in Genesis 11, we see 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. This structure is too clean. History is messy. Families don't produce a great man exactly every 10th generation like clockwork. This is a mnemonic device, a memory aid for an oral culture. By structuring history into blocks of 10, the storytellers could memorize the sequence. It is the same reason the Sumerian king list creates rigid structures. We are reading the script of a performance, intended to be recited around a fire, not the census data of a civil servant. When we treat it as literal history, we are abusing the text. We are asking it to be something it was never designed to be. Let's circle back to the psychological aspect. Why do people defend these numbers so fiercely today? Why is it that, for many, the validity of their entire worldview hangs on whether a man named Jared lived to be 962? It comes down to the domino theory of faith. The fear is that if Genesis 5 is myth, then Genesis 1 is myth. And if Genesis 1 is myth, there is no original sin. And without original sin, the rest of the theological structure begins to wobble. To admit that the begats are folklore is to pull a loose thread that might unravel the entire garment. So, rational people are forced to defend the irrational. They are forced to invent vapor canopies and rapid-speed evolution to protect the integrity of a list of names. This defense often leads to a strange dissonance. We have people who accept the complex science of smartphones and MRI machines, science built on physics and biology, that contradicts the premise of Genesis 5, yet they compartmentalize. They hold two opposing realities in their heads. In one reality, cells die and organisms decay according to the laws of thermodynamics. In the other reality, ancient men lived for a millennium because a book says so. But there is another layer here, a sociological one. The structure of Genesis 5 serves to define us versus them. In the ancient world, genealogies were political documents. They established land rights, tribal alliances, and social hierarchy. By tracing a direct, unbroken line from the first man to the fathers of Israel, the text is making a claim of supremacy. It is saying, we are the inheritors of the original blessing. This is why the genealogy excludes Cain. If you remember the story, Adam had another son, Cain, who built a city and founded a line of descendants who invented metallurgy and music. But that line is cut off, erased by the flood. Genesis 5 focuses only on the line of Seth, the replacement. It is a narrative pruning. It tells the reader that true heritage comes not from the city builders and the inventors, but from the obedient. It is a moral judgment disguised as a family tree. Furthermore, we have to consider the gap problem. Apologists who realize the timeline is too short compared to archaeological evidence often suggest there are gaps in the genealogy, that son could mean descendant, and therefore these lists could span tens of thousands of years. While son can mean descendant in Hebrew, Genesis 5 doesn't allow for this. Loophole. It uses a very specific formula. When X was Y years old, he fathered Z. It gives the specific age of the father at the birth of the specific son. You cannot insert gaps into a mathematical formula. If Seth was 105 when Enosh was born, there is no room for missing centuries. The text is ruthlessly specific, and that specificity is its undoing when held up against the light of history. We know from archaeology that human civilization, cities, agriculture, writing, emerged gradually over thousands of years. We have continuous records of cultures in Egypt, China, and the Americas that run right through the supposed date of the biblical flood. These cultures didn't notice they were being drowned. They kept making pottery, brewing beer, and tracking the stars. The timeline provided by Genesis 5, which places the flood roughly 4,500 years ago, is irreconcilable with the physical evidence of human occupation on this planet. There are civilizations with uninterrupted histories that predate the biblical chronology of Adam. To accept Genesis 5 as history, you have to believe that the pyramids were built underwater, or that the entire history of dynastic Egypt is a fabrication. It forces a choice between the observable world and the text. And this brings us to the Enoch anomaly. In the middle of this repetitive rhythm of, "and then he died," we hit Enoch. The text says Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He is the only one in the list who escapes death. This breaks the pattern of the inevitability of mortality. It introduces the concept of ascension, a theme that will recur throughout the mythology. But look at his age, 365 years. Does that number ring a bell? 365. It is the number of days in a solar year. This is not a coincidence. This is solar mythology encoded into a genealogy. Enoch is likely a solar figure, or the duration of his life is symbolic of a complete cycle. The ancient writers were obsessed with astronomical cycles. To ignore the symbolism of 365 is to ignore the cultural literacy of the authors. It is a signal to the reader that we have left the realm of biography and entered the realm of cosmology. If we treat Genesis 5 as a puzzle, the pieces fit together beautifully. We have Mesopotamian influence in the structure, solar symbolism in the numbers, political maneuvering in the selection of names, and a theological agenda in the overall narrative. It is a masterpiece of ancient literature. But when we treat it as biology, when we treat it as history, it fails. It fails completely. It fails because it demands that we suspend everything we have learned about the human species in the last 5,000 years. It asks us to pretend that the laws of the universe used to be different just to accommodate a story. The irony is that by insisting on the literal truth of these chapters, fundamentalists actually strip them of their real meaning. They turn a rich, symbolic mythology into bad science. They turn a poem into a police report. And in doing so, they make it fragile, because a poem can survive being myth. A poem speaks to the human condition. But a police report that lies about the ages of the witnesses, that gets thrown out of court. If we are honest with the text, we have to admit that Genesis 5 is a construct. It is the once upon a time of the Hebrew Bible. It sets a stage. It creates a legendary past to explain a difficult present. It reflects the human desire for a golden age, a time when we were stronger, lived longer, and were closer to the gods. We see this nostalgia in every culture. The Greeks had the age of heroes. The Hindus have the yugas. The idea that we are physically diminishing, that we are lesser than our fathers, is a universal psychological bias. We look at the ruins of the past and think, there were giants in those days. Genesis 5 captures that feeling and crystallizes it into numbers. But looking back at it now, with the tools of modern analysis, we can see the scaffolding. We can see where the builders borrowed materials from Babylon. We can see where they fudged the math to make the ends meet. We can see the human fingerprints all over the divine text. This realization doesn't have to be aggressive. It is simply a maturity. It is the moment you realize that the stories your parents told you about Santa Claus were logically inconsistent. You don't hate the story, but you no longer wait up at night listening for reindeer. You understand the function of the myth. Genesis 5 is the reindeer on the roof. It is a story told by a young civilization trying to make sense of its place in a terrifyingly old world. They didn't have carbon dating. They didn't have genetics. They had stories, and they wove those stories into a lineage that gave them dignity and purpose. But we are not them. We have the carbon dating. We have the genetics. We have the ability to read the rocks and the stars. And they tell a story far grander and more complex than a list of begats. They tell a story of a species that clawed its way up from the dirt, not down from the clouds. A species that didn't start with 900-year lifespans, but with brutal, short lives that we have slowly, painfully extended through our own ingenuity. That is the real story. The story of how we went from living to 30, to living to 80. Not by divine magic, but by sanitation, medicine, and reason. That is the genealogy that matters. The genealogy of ideas. So when we close the book on Genesis 5, we aren't losing history. We are shedding superstition. We are stepping out of the shadow of the ziggurat and into the light of reality. And reality, with all its flaws and limits, is far more interesting than the myth. This brings us to the edge of the narrative cliff. The genealogy of chapter 5 isn't just a list, it is a countdown. It is a ticking clock winding down to the moment the writers decide to wipe the slate clean. But just before the deluge, in the opening verses of chapter 6, the text stumbles. It breaks character in a way that reveals its polytheistic DNA. We find a passage that has baffled theologians for millennia because it doesn't belong in a monotheistic book. It speaks of the sons of God seeing the daughters of humans and taking them as wives. It speaks of the Nephilim, giants, heroes of old, men of renown. This is not the language of a singular, omnipotent creator. This is the language of Greek mythology. This is Zeus coming down to seduce mortal women. This is the stuff of titans and demigods. It is a fragment of a much older pagan worldview that the editors of Genesis forgot to scrub out. It shows us that the God of Genesis wasn't always alone. He was once part of a pantheon, a divine council, where lesser deities could rogue and mate with humans. The inclusion of the Nephilim is a fossil. It proves that the book is an evolution of myth, not a revelation of truth. A perfect, dictated text wouldn't contain the confused remnants of the religions it was trying to replace. But it gets worse. Because the solution to this corruption of humanity is the flood, and here the Bible stops being just a book of bad biology and becomes a book of stolen property. If you go to the British Museum today, you can see a clay tablet, specifically the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. When George Smith, an assistant at the museum, first translated this in the 1870 seconds, he was so overwhelmed he began to undress himself in the office. He realized he was looking at the death of biblical uniqueness. The tablet tells the story of Utnapishtim, a man warned by a god that a great flood is coming to destroy mankind. He is told to build a boat, to pitch it with bitumen, to take the seed of all living things. The storm comes. The birds are released to find land, a dove, a swallow, a raven. When the raven doesn't return, he knows it is safe to exit. He offers a sacrifice, and the gods smell the sweet savour. Sound familiar? It should. It is the story of Noah, beat for beat. But here is the problem. The Epic of Gilgamesh predates the writing of Genesis by centuries. The biblical authors didn't just come up with a similar idea. They plagiarized the homework of the Babylonians. Apologists will try to tell you that this proves the flood really happened, that both cultures remembered the same event. But look at the details, the timeline, the birds, the specific use of bitumen, the sweet smell of the sacrifice. These are literary fingerprints. You don't independently hallucinate the exact same narrative, structure. The Hebrew scribes, living in exile in Babylon, heard the stories of their captors and appropriated them. They took Utnapishtim and renamed him Noah. They took the squabbling Babylonian gods and replaced them with Yahweh. It is cultural appropriation masked as divine history. But let's set aside the plagiarism for a moment and look at the logistics, because nothing exposes the failure of the Bible quite like the engineering of the ark. We are told the dimensions: 300 cubits long, roughly 450 feet, built of gopher wood. We are asked to believe that a 600-year-old man and his 3 sons built a vessel larger than any wooden ship ever successfully sailed in human history. We actually tried to build wooden ships this big in the early 20th century. The Wyoming was a 6-masted schooner built by professional shipwrights with modern tools and steel bracing. It was 329 feet long, and it was a death trap. It twisted in the waves. The wood couldn't handle the stress. It leaked constantly, requiring steam pumps to keep it afloat, until it eventually flexed too much and sank. Wood is a material with limits. Physics dictates that a wooden vessel of the ark's size, laden with the weight of thousands of animals and food, would hog and sag. In rough seas and a global flood is the definition of rough seas. The hull would have snapped like a dry twig within hours. There is no miraculous engineering workaround here. It is a structural impossibility. And then there is the cargo. We all know the nursery rhyme version: 2 of every animal. But the text actually specifies 7 pairs of clean animals and flying creatures. Do the math on the biodiversity of Earth. Even if we reduce it to kinds or families to help the creationists out, you are talking about thousands upon thousands of cages. Where did they store the food? An elephant eats hundreds of pounds of vegetation a day. A carnival of carnivores requires fresh meat, unless the lions were eating the gazelles they were supposed to be saving. The sheer biomass of the food required for a year-long voyage would take up more space than the animals themselves. And let's talk about the problem nobody likes to mention in Sunday school: waste management. Thousands of animals pooping in a sealed wooden box with a single window for ventilation. The build-up of methane alone would have been toxic. Ammonia levels would have scorched the lungs of everything on board. The ark wouldn't have been a sanctuary. It would have been a floating septic tank. The inhabitants would have died of asphyxiation or disease long before the waters receded. But the logistics of the boat are trivial compared to the logistics of the water itself. Where did it come from? The text says the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened. If enough water to cover Mount Everest existed in the atmosphere as vapor, the atmospheric pressure would be crushing, roughly 900 times our current pressure. We would be living on the surface of Venus. If the water came from underground, the fountains of the deep, the geological violence required to release that much volume would melt the crust. This is basic thermodynamics. The energy released by falling rain and bursting subterranean reservoirs sufficient to cover the highest peaks would generate massive amounts of heat. Calculations show that the water would not be a cool, refreshing rain. It would be boiling. The ark would be floating in a global cauldron of superheated soup. Noah wouldn't need an umbrella. He would need a heat shield. And then, just as magically as it appears, the water vanishes. Where does it go? There is no drain at the bottom of the ocean. If the world was covered above the highest mountains, That water is still here. The fact that we are dry right now proves it never happened. The geological record confirms this silence. If a global flood happened 4,000 years ago, we would see a distinct, uniform layer of sediment across the entire planet. We would see all the animals buried together. Dinosaurs mixed with cows, mixed with humans, sorting by density, not by evolution. But we don't see that. We see a meticulously ordered geological column. We see independent local flood layers in different regions at different times, but never one universal event. The civilizations of the time confirm this too. We have records from the 6th dynasty of Egypt. They were building, trading, and writing right through the alleged date of the flood. They didn't seem to notice that they were supposed to be underwater. The bristlecone pines in California, some nearly 5,000 years old, have tree rings that show no scarring from being submerged in salt water for a year. They just kept growing. The reality of the world simply ignores the claims of the book. But the most damning failure of the flood narrative isn't geological or engineering based, it is moral. And this is where the good book truly fails its readers. The story begins with God regretting that he made man. Think about the implications of that. An all-knowing, all-powerful being makes a mistake. He looks at his own work and says, I shouldn't have done this. This contradicts the very definition of omniscience. If you know the future, you cannot have regrets. You cannot be surprised by the outcome of your own design. And his solution to this regret? Genocide, omnicide, the destruction of every breathing thing. Not just the wicked humans, but the animals, the birds, the infants. What crime did the infants commit? What sin did the koalas commit? This is the logic of a tantrum. It is the behavior of a petulant child kicking over a tower of blocks because it didn't look right. But we are told to view this character as the standard of objective morality. We are told that God is love in the same breath that we are told he drowned the entire world. If a human dictator drowned a single city because it didn't worship him correctly, we would call him a monster. We would drag him to The Hague. But when the protagonist of the Bible drowns the planet, we are asked to call it justice. This creates a moral distortion field. It trains believers to accept atrocities as long as they are divinely mandated. It breaks the moral compass by tethering it to the whims of a violent literary character rather than to human well-being. And what was the result of this cleansing? Did it work? Did the flood fix humanity? According to the text, no. Immediately after getting off the boat, Noah gets drunk and passes out naked. Hardly the behavior of the most righteous man on earth. And the descendants of Noah go right back to being wicked, building the Tower of Babel, worshipping other gods. So the flood was not only a moral atrocity, it was a practical failure. It accomplished nothing. The omnipotent God used the nuclear option and missed the target. The world after the flood was just as fallen as the world before it, forcing the question, what was the point? The point, of course, is that it never happened. It is a myth explaining why floods occur, why the rainbow appears, and why the Babylonians are the enemies. It is a story, but when you force it to be history, you are left with a God who is either incompetent, powerless, or malevolent. We also have to trace the survivors. If the ark landed in the Middle East 4,000 years ago, all animal life radiated from that point. We should see a gradient of fossils and living species spreading out from Turkey. But that is not what we see. We see marsupials exclusively in Australia. We see lemurs exclusively in Madagascar. How did the slow-moving sloth travel from Mount Ararat to the Amazon rainforest without leaving a single fossil in Europe or Africa? How did the koala make it to Sydney when it only eats fresh eucalyptus leaves, which don't grow on the migration path? Did the penguins walk through the deserts of the Middle East to get to Antarctica? Biogeography is the enemy of Genesis. The distribution of animals on our planet tells a story of millions of years of continental drift and isolated evolution, not a frantic sprint from a wooden boat 4 millennia ago. The kangaroo didn't hop across the ocean. It evolved there. The text requires us to believe in a miraculous teleportation of species that defies every law of biology and geography. And let's look at the human migration. If we are all descendants of Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, then human genetics should show a severe bottleneck 4,000 years ago. We should all be practically clones. But our DNA tells a different story. We have genetic markers that trace back tens of thousands of years, diverging into distinct populations long before the alleged flood. We have indigenous populations in the Americas whose ancestors crossed the land bridge from Asia 15,000 years ago. The Bible claims they didn't exist until Noah's grandkids started moving around. The DNA in your own blood carries the receipt that proves the Bible is wrong. As we move past the flood, the text shifts gears. We enter the era of the Tower of Babel, another just so story designed to explain something the ancients didn't understand: language. They looked around and saw different tribes speaking different tongues. It was confusing enough to be seen as a curse, so they invented a backstory. They claimed that originally the whole world had one language and a common speech. Linguistics tells us this is false. Language is organic. It evolves like a living thing. It branches and mutates over time. There was never a single, static, proto-language spoken by all humanity in 2500 BCE. We can trace the roots of Indo-European languages. We can see how Latin shifted into French and Spanish. It is a slow, branching process, not a sudden, supernatural scrambling of the brain. The story of Babel reveals the insecurity of the biblical God. He sees humans building a tower, a ziggurat, and he says, if, as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Read that again. The creator of the universe is afraid of human cooperation. He is threatened by a brick building. He isn't a cosmic father. He is a jealous rival. He scrambles their language not because they are wicked, but because they are capable. It is a story that explicitly frames human progress and unity as an offense to God. This is the anti-humanism at the core of Genesis. Knowledge is punished in the garden. Life is shortened in the genealogies. Civilization is drowned in the flood, and cooperation is shattered at Babel. At every turn, the text tells us that to be human, to build, to learn, to live long, to work together, is to be an enemy of the divine. It is a theology of suppression. It teaches that we are broken, that our achievements are arrogant, and that our destruction is deserved. It is a mindset that breeds passivity, because if human progress is an affront to God, why try to improve the world? Why cure diseases if death is the wage of sin? Why build a global community if God wants us scattered? But the narrative of the Bible is about to shift again. It moves from the global to the local, from the mythic to the tribal. We are about to meet Abraham. And if you think the morality of the flood was questionable, the morality of the patriarchs will leave you breathless. We are leaving the realm of talking snakes and impossible boats, and entering the realm of human politics, desert warfare, and the invention of a covenant that will spill blood for the next 4,000 years. The mythological training wheels are coming off, and the real ugliness of Bronze Age tribalism is about to begin. The global narrative is now collapsing into the local. The stage is cleared. The impossible ages and the drowned world are finished. What remains is the promise of one man, Abraham. When the biblical text introduces Abraham, we leave the land of cosmic creation and enter the land of geopolitical claims. This shift is not accidental. The creation myths, the genealogies, the flood, all of that scaffolding was built to establish one singular, crucial point, that this man and his descendants are the inheritors of the earth. The story of Abraham is the founding charter of a tribe. But when we search for this foundational figure in the historical record, we are met with silence. Abraham is claimed to be a powerful chieftain, moving through Mesopotamia and Canaan, interacting with major city-states and Egyptian pharaohs. Yet, the contemporary documents of those cultures, the meticulously kept records of Egypt, the detailed clay tablets of Babylonian kings, they contain no mention of him. If a man wealthy enough to muster hundreds of soldiers and make treaties with kings existed, he would not be invisible. The historical figures who lived during the alleged patriarchal period left massive, indelible marks. Their names are on monuments. Their treaties are preserved on baked clay. Abraham is a ghost. He exists only within the pages of the biblical text. This is not a failure of archaeology. It is a success of literary invention. The patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are not historical persons. They are eponyms. They are figures created to provide an origin story for a later settled ethnic group. Abraham is the story of their beginnings. Jacob is the story of their struggles. And the later stories are the justification for their claim to the land. And the morality of this founding narrative is as questionable as the physics of the flood. The centerpiece of Abraham's story is the binding of Isaac, or the Akedah. The biblical God commands Abraham to take his son, his only son, the heir of the covenant, and murder him, a ritual sacrifice on a mountain altar. This story is held up as the ultimate example of faith and obedience, a perfect surrender of human will to divine command. But if we read it with an ounce of human empathy, it is a story of moral horror. The text demands that we celebrate a father who is willing to violate the most sacred human bond, to execute his innocent child based purely on an audible instruction. We are asked to accept that a good God would demand such an act, not as a test of virtue, but as a test of absolute subservience. The lesson of the Akedah is not about faith. It is about the destruction of moral autonomy. It teaches that your own inherent sense of right and wrong, the understanding that murdering your child is wrong, must be silenced if a voice tells you otherwise. It places obedience to the perceived divine above fundamental human ethics. This narrative reflects the cultural moment in which it was written. In the ancient Near East, child sacrifice was a gruesome reality. The neighbors of Israel, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Phoenicians, practiced it. The story of Abraham stopping at the last minute is not necessarily a story of moral progress. It's a story of sublimation, of moving from the literal murder of the child to the symbolic surrender of the will. But the demand itself remains, and it is monstrous. If a man today told you that the voice of God commanded him to take his child to a mountain with a knife, you wouldn't praise his faith. You would call the police. Our current secular moral structure instinctively recognizes this command as psychotic and evil. The fact that the story is celebrated in religious traditions shows how deeply divine mandate can corrupt natural human decency. This patriarchal narrative introduces one of the most powerful sociological innovations in religious history, the portable God. In Abraham's time, most gods were tied to the land. If you left your territory, you left your God. Yahweh, however, makes a covenant with a man who is wandering. Abraham's God goes with him. This is a revolutionary concept. It means that his people could be driven from their land, they could be taken into exile, their temple could be destroyed, yet their God remained with them. This portability is what allowed the Abrahamic religions to survive. The destruction that ended the worship of the local Canaanite gods simply strengthened the devotion to Yahweh. Because he was not dependent on geography, he was dependent on the covenant. This brilliant sociological framework is the reason these religions spread and endured. It is a highly adaptive idea, but an adaptive idea is not the same thing as a verifiable truth. As the lineage continues through Isaac and Jacob, the narrative continues its trend of moral ambiguity. Jacob steals his brother Esau's birthright through deception and lies. He then tricks his father-in-law, Laban, out of his livestock through clever, quasi-magical selective breeding. These are not pristine heroes. They are flawed tricksters, and the text makes no apologies for their deception. The story is justifying the means. It is telling the Israelite tribes, our claim to this land and our prosperity is rooted in the fact that our ancestors were cunning, shrewd, and sometimes deceptive. We won because we were smarter than the other guys. This is a valuable lesson for a nomadic tribe fighting for survival. But it further undermines the idea that this is a morally perfect, divinely sanctioned history. It is simply the story of a successful lineage justifying its success. The entire foundation of the Abrahamic covenant, the idea of a chosen people, is itself an exercise in intellectual division. It is the ultimate expression of the us versus them mentality. The entire system is built on an arbitrary selection. Why Abraham? Why these descendants? The text offers no rational reason. It is the literary equivalent of a parent saying, I love you best. It demands exclusivity and sets the stage for thousands of years of conflict based on a bloodline. This entire patriarchal period, when viewed without the lens of faith, becomes a series of literary and ethical failures. Biologically impossible ages lead to a logistically impossible flood, which leads to the moral disaster of the Akedah, which leads to the political invention of the chosen people. The failures are compounding. Each layer of the story exists not to reflect reality, but to rationalize the beliefs and geopolitical ambitions of the group who eventually codified the text. We must ask ourselves, if the foundation is based on fables and moral contradictions, what does that mean for the structure built on top of it? Because the next major failure of the Bible is when we move from the desert chiefs to the massive geopolitical claims of the Exodus, and the historical evidence, or lack thereof, becomes absolutely deafening. The failures we have documented so far, the biological, the mathematical, the moral, are all confined to the prehistory of the text, the creation and the patriarchs. But when the biblical narrative moves into the Exodus, when it claims to record the movement of 2 million people across the desert and the establishment of a new nation, the failures stop being merely literary and become geopolitical and archaeological. The Exodus narrative is the single most important event in the biblical tradition. It is the founding myth of Israel, the origin of the Ten Commandments, and the moment God publicly demonstrates his power. The story is explicit. 600,000 men, not including women and children, left Egypt after 10 devastating plagues. This means the total population was likely between 2 and 3 million people. Now, let's approach this with simple logistics. 2 million people is more than the population of modern-day Boston or Philadelphia, or the combined total of medieval London and Paris. Imagine moving that many people, plus their livestock, through the Sinai Desert for 40 years. First, the simple logistical needs. Every day, 2 million people need water. Even at a severely restricted intake of just half a gallon per person per day, that is 1 million gallons of water needed daily. You cannot sustain that kind of demand from the sparse, seasonal springs of the Sinai Peninsula. The claim that water was miraculously provided from a rock or that a single small well could supply this population for a day defies the laws of hydrogeology. Next, consider the sanitation. A population of 2 million produces an immense amount of waste. If they were moving every few days, the archaeological footprint would be catastrophic. The text itself mentions that they were commanded to bury their waste outside the camp, but over 40 years, this would require burying approximately 700,000 tons of human waste. The area would be covered in a deep, telltale layer of organic sediment. Yet, despite decades of exhaustive search by archaeologists specializing in the Sinai and the Egyptian Delta, there is zero physical evidence of this massive migration. There are no pottery shards. The unique ceramic technology of the people of Canaan, which the Israelites supposedly possessed, should have left billions of fragments. There are no mass burial sites. 2 million people traveling for 40 years would experience hundreds of thousands of deaths from old age, disease, and accident. Where are the graves? Where are the simple tools, the cooking hearths, the abandoned infrastructure of a city on the move? The desert preserves things. It is an excellent preservative. But in the Sinai, for the Exodus, there is nothing. The absence of evidence is itself a profound argument. The logistics of managing 2 million people for 4 decades in the desert is practically the equivalent of a modern military campaign. The impact on the fragile ecosystem of the Sinai would be visible from space, but the historical record is silent. But the biblical failure is not just in the Sinai. It is also in Egypt itself. If the entire economic and social structure of Egypt was shattered by 10 successive plagues, including the loss of all livestock, the obliteration of the primary grain source, hail, and the death of every firstborn child, the Egyptian records would be consumed by this disaster. We would find lamentations, collapse narratives, and official documents detailing the crisis. But the pharaonic records, which are meticulous and exhaustive, show a seamless continuity during the alleged period of the Exodus. There is no mention of a slave population of 2 million suddenly vanishing. There is no mention of a military disaster or a crippling economic catastrophe. Pharaohs continued their building projects. Trade continued. The dynasties transitioned smoothly. The Egyptian world simply did not notice the event that the Bible claims was the turning point of world history. This leads to the realization that the Exodus story is not history. It is a redaction, a narrative created during a later period of exile to serve a specific theological and national purpose. Most scholars now agree that the core of the story likely comes from the experience of a smaller group. A contingent of Canaanite or Proto-Israelite people who were enslaved in Egypt, perhaps working on delta irrigation projects. Their escape, which may have been a minor local incident, was later magnified and embellished into a national epic. The trauma of the escape was universalized and mythologized. The 100 people became 2 million. The local skirmish became the divine war. This process of narrative inflation is evident when we look at the conquest of Canaan that follows the Exodus. The biblical narrative, particularly the book of Joshua, describes a swift, brutal military campaign. City after city, Jericho, Ai, Hazor, is conquered, burned, and their populations annihilated by the newly arrived Israelites. This narrative provides a clear, divine justification for the dispossession of the Canaanite people. God ordered the genocide to make room for his chosen. Again, archaeology provides the cold, hard counter-evidence. When archaeologists excavate the sites mentioned in the book of Joshua, the facts simply do not line up with the text. Take Jericho. The Bible claims the walls fell and the city was sacked by Joshua. Archaeological evidence shows that the site was either unoccupied or heavily fortified, but never destroyed during the time frame of the alleged conquest, the Late Bronze Age. The magnificent walls that supposedly fell were destroyed centuries before the Israelites were meant to have arrived. The story of Jericho is a powerful military epic, but it is not a police report. It is a founding myth. The same lack of confirmation holds true for Ai and Hazor. While Hazor was certainly destroyed, the destruction layers do not align with a sudden Israelite invasion. The evidence suggests that the Israelites did not conquer Canaan from the outside. They emerged from within. The consensus among historians is that the people who became the Israelites were largely Canaanite peasants who rebelled against the coastal city-states. They migrated into the central highlands and developed a distinct identity that included the worship of Yahweh. The Exodus and conquest narratives, therefore, are not historical accounts of an invasion. They are internal political charters. They are stories written centuries later to define who the Israelites were, where their land came from, and why they were ethically superior to their neighbors. By treating these texts as myth, they become fascinating sociological documents. They are the evidence of a people building an identity out of shared memory and trauma. But by treating them as history, they become a complete failure. They are contradicted by the geology of the desert, the economics of Egypt, the physics of water, and the very ground beneath the supposed battle sites. And this is the ultimate failure of the Bible: its inconsistency of purpose. It demands to be read as a history book, yet it contains no verifiable history. It demands to be read as a science book, yet it contradicts every known law of physics and biology. It demands to be read as a moral guide, yet it celebrates genocide and the attempted murder of an innocent child. The only way to reconcile these contradictions is to acknowledge the true nature of the text. It is a library, a compilation of Bronze Age tribal lore, Mesopotamian myths, political charters, and wisdom literature. It is a profoundly human document, and that human reality is far more compelling than the claim of divine perfection. The true story is not about a God leading a perfect people to a promised land. The true story is about a tiny, besieged tribe who managed to create a powerful, enduring narrative that allowed their ideas, if not their numbers, to conquer the world. They survived because they were great storytellers, not because they were great historians. The grand narrative of the Exodus and conquest has failed to materialize on the ground. Now, the biblical narrative turns inward, focusing on the laws and rituals that define the newly formed identity. These law codes, primarily found in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, introduce a failure that is purely moral and social, a failure to provide a truly ethical or humane framework for society. These codes, far from being eternal, divine wisdom, are a patchwork of Bronze Age taboos, necessary public health regulations for desert life, and tribal power consolidation disguised as universal morality. When we analyze them, we find laws that are ethically repugnant to modern sensibilities placed right alongside rules about what kind of fabric you can wear. Consider the laws regarding slavery. The Bible does not condemn slavery. It regulates it. It provides detailed instructions on how to acquire and treat your property. Exodus 21:7-8 permits selling your daughter into slavery. Exodus 21:22-1 dictates that if you beat a male or female slave to death, you shall surely be punished, unless the slave survives for a day or two, in which case the owner is acquitted because the slave is considered the owner's property. This is not a God-given moral code. This is a labor contract written in the ancient Near East. It places economic value above human life, and it demonstrates that the moral evolution of the text lagged far behind basic human empathy. A genuinely timeless moral code would unequivocally condemn the ownership of another human being, not provide an exemption for accidental murder. The law also fails in its approach to sexual and social justice. Leviticus prescribes death for homosexual acts, yet it barely punishes rape. Deuteronomy 22:28-9 states that if a man rapes a virgin who is not pledged to be married, he must pay her father 50 shekels of silver and must marry the woman because he has humbled her. He can never divorce her. The victim is not given justice. She is given a life sentence to her attacker. Her value is reduced to property damage. This code is misogynistic and victim-blaming. It is a reflection of a patriarchal, tribal society, not the wisdom of an all-loving deity. The complexity of these laws introduces the psychological failure of guilt and fear. By codifying thousands of specific rules, from dietary restrictions to complex purification rites, the text ensures that every human being is perpetually in violation. You are never truly clean, never truly righteous. This perpetual state of transgression serves a vital sociological purpose. It transfers power. Only the religious intermediaries, the priests, have the knowledge and the authority to guide you through the maze of sin and ritual cleansing. The common person is kept in a state of dependency and chronic anxiety. The system is designed to create spiritual leverage. It is an ingenious way to ensure the priesthood remains socially and economically indispensable. But perhaps the most profound failure is in the area of prophecy. Prophecy is often held up as the proof of divine authorship, the proof that the biblical God has foreknowledge and has shared his plan with humanity. But when we examine the most celebrated prophecies, they fall apart under scrutiny. Many fulfilled prophecies are simply vague political predictions or post-diction. Events that have already happened are written as if they were prophesied. For example, many prophecies concerning the destruction of Jerusalem or the return from exile were clearly written during or after those events occurred. The authors were writing history and calling it prophecy. Other supposed prophecies fail entirely. Consider the prophecies regarding the complete and irreversible destruction of certain cities like Tyre or Babylon. While these cities did suffer military defeats and periods of decline, they were never utterly erased from the map. Tyre, in particular, remains an inhabited port city today. The text promised total desolation, yet the city survived. The prophecy failed. When religious figures claim prophecy is a solid foundation for belief, they ignore the base rate fallacy. If you make thousands of vague, bold predictions, some of them are bound to seem fulfilled by coincidence or by interpreting ambiguous language through a confirmation bias. Nostradamus works the same way. To use prophecy as proof of an omniscient being is to apply a different standard of evidence than we would use for any other extraordinary claim. This system of guilt, law, and failed prophecy ultimately breeds a deep anti-intellectualism. The entire structure is built on the premise that doubt is a moral failure. It teaches that skepticism is not a path to greater truth, but a sin against obedience. Questioning the 900-year lifespans, the ark's capacity, or the morality of the law is framed not as an academic exercise, but as a direct challenge to the divine. This intellectual, Suppression is perhaps the Bible's most lasting failure. It has created a cultural inertia that resists evidence. It places the authority of a flawed, ancient, redacted text above the observable, testable reality of the natural world. The irony is that the search for truth, the very human desire to understand the cosmos, the desire that created science and medicine, is constantly hindered by the very book that claims to contain all answers. When the Bible fails to align with biology, physics, or history, the default response is to attack the science, not the scripture. But the failure is complete. From the first impossible age in Genesis 5, through the plagiarized flood, the morally bankrupt laws, the silent archaeology of the Exodus, and the failed prophecies, the evidence points to one conclusion. The Bible is a human product, an extraordinary, influential, beautiful, and deeply flawed human document. And in that flawed humanity, we find the real lesson. We are not doomed to follow the ethical framework of a Bronze Age text. We have the capacity for moral growth. We recognize the horror of slavery and child sacrifice, despite the biblical text, not because of it. We use science to extend life far beyond Methuselah's alleged 900 years, not by invoking divine vapor canopies, but by applying human reason. The grand failure of the Bible is its inability to be what it claims to be, a perfect, supernatural revelation. Its success is its ability to reveal the enduring, complicated, and often cruel story of humanity itself. The ultimate failure of the Bible is not just in its scientific or historical contradictions, but in the limited, often destructive framework it offers for human flourishing. The final piece of this analysis must be to contrast this failed framework with the powerful, evidence-based alternative, secular humanism and reason. The biblical narrative begins and ends with an attempt to manage human experience through fear. In the garden, it is the fear of knowledge and the fear of a jealous God. In the law, it is the fear of uncleanness and eternal punishment. This dependence on fear creates a static morality, one where ethics are external, unchanging, and enforced by threat. It is a system that views humanity as inherently broken, requiring constant supervision and correction from above. But the failure of this fear-based morality is evident in the real world. History shows that faith has often been the justification for atrocity. From the Crusades and the Inquisitions to the contemporary acts of violence committed in the name of purity and obedience, the lack of moral autonomy fostered by these texts has a bloody legacy. When people are taught that their conscience is unreliable and that only divine command matters, they become capable of terrible acts because the command always trumps empathy. The triumph of human reason contrasts the biblical failure with the triumph of human reason. Our moral evolution, the genuine improvement in the human condition, has consistently happened in opposition to, or outside the boundaries of, divine texts. We abolished slavery, not because Exodus or Leviticus provided a clear condemnation, they didn't, but because Enlightenment philosophers and activists applied universal reason and the principle of inherent human dignity. We established universal human rights because we abandoned the idea of a chosen people and embraced the concept of shared humanity. The secular worldview, unlike the biblical framework, is dynamic and self-correcting. It understands that morality is not static. It must evolve as our knowledge and understanding of the world deepen. When science disproves a biblical claim, reason embraces the new evidence. When society recognizes an injustice, such as the mistreatment of women or LGBTQ+ individuals, reason compels us to change the law, even if an ancient text forbids it. This is the great success of a post-biblical worldview. It places epistemological authority the authority to know on observation, testability, and consensus, rather than on ancient authority or dogma. We trust the collective, verifiable work of thousands of scientists over the single, unsubstantiated claim of a 2,000-year-old manuscript. The power of the observable world. The observable world, which the Bible repeatedly failed to accurately describe in Genesis 5, is the true source of wonder and wisdom. The story of the cosmos, told by astrophysics and biology, of 13.8 billion years of cosmic evolution, of planetary formation, and of life evolving from a single cell, is infinitely more grand and more beautiful than a 6-day creation and a 20-foot boat. The complexity of the human brain, which allows us to write poetry, compose symphonies, and unravel the structure of the atom, is a greater miracle than any biblical miracle. And this miracle is achieved without recourse to the supernatural. By discarding the failed narrative of Genesis 5 and the subsequent history, we don't lose meaning, we gain it. We move from having a meaning imposed upon us to you were created to obey. You are fundamentally flawed to a meaning that is created by us. Our lives gain value because they are finite. Our morality gains urgency because it is ours to create. The purpose of human life becomes clear: to reduce suffering and increase knowledge. This is a moral framework rooted in compassion and evidence. It requires no threats of hell or promises of an ethereal reward. The reward is the observable improvement of life, right here, right now. The history of the Bible, then, becomes a powerful lesson in what to leave behind. It is a monument to human struggle, human creativity, and human fear. But, as an instruction manual for the modern world, it fails. It fails in its numbers, it fails in its morals, and it fails in its capacity to lead us forward. By recognizing that nothing fails like a book demanding to be something it is not, we become free to embrace the true success story, the ongoing, self-corrected journey of humanity itself.